Welcome to the voice of St. Anthony Parish from Allston, Massachusetts, right here on WROL, 950 AM, 100.3 FM, and you can also hear us at CatholicAudiomedia.com. It comes from St. Anthony Parish in Allston, where you have a standing invitation to come to our 10 o'clock AM Mass. We're going to go right over to our final part of the interview with Leonard J. DeLorenzo on his book, Our Faithful Departed, Where They Are and Why It Matters. I loved what you did with St. Thomas. Maybe
this is St. Thomas the Apostle.
Yes. Yeah. I love preaching on St. Thomas after Easter, but I loved the way you talked about it. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I think it comes up, I kind of stay with Thomas in a number of different places, but just to maybe give a little bit of a preview, something that I've really spent a lot of time with in the last couple of years is something that's sort of buried in that narrative of Thomas. So first, as people recall, Jesus appears to the other 10 in the upper room,
right,
and Thomas is not there. And then we get the narrative from the following week when Thomas is there, and that's what we all remember. Thomas, who would not believe, comes to believe because he can take his hand and put it into the Lord's wounds, as the Lord invites him to do. But the thing, and this is so obvious, but the thing that caught me is actually the link between those. It says, now a week later, which means there was a whole week in between. Mm-hmm. And I've come to really contemplate that loneliest week. That must have been the loneliest week. Not only has Thomas been separated from his teacher, his Lord, he also in that week must have experienced incredible separation from the others, that they have experienced something that he has not, that there is a reason for joy in them that he does not have. And it is a marvelous sign of the Lord's generosity and grace in the way in which the Lord comes to him. It's to reckon with both of those wounds, the real depth of that wound, that it's in the same place that the Lord comes back to him, that place is where the Lord gave him his body and blood at the Last Supper. It was where their communion was the most intimate, and immediately upon giving that gift, that communion started to break. And so that is the first place of Thomas's grief, of his woundedness. It's also then doubly a source of grief and woundedness, because that's the place where the others were and he was not, where they had been formed together in some way that he does not grasp and understand. But the Lord comes to him right there. And I think that it shows us, or it indicates to us, look, the resurrection is a complete job. It is the resurrection of the Lord, which is communicated totally and wholly, very personally to Thomas. Thomas encounters the Lord as living, and the Lord living who redeems Thomas's own memory and woundedness of the breaking of the communion with the Lord and of his alienation of the communion with his brothers.
Wow.
It's sort of challenged and deepened and stretched my own understanding of doubting Thomas, if you will. I mean, that's the way in which we're very first presented with Thomas, as the one who doubts, and we see the unwillingness to believe as his primary characteristic. But if we see him from the encounter with the Lord, what we see, I think, is something else. Here is the one to whom the Lord brought the fullness of the resurrection and communicated it to him personally, reckoning with Thomas's own wounds, so that the Lord fits himself to the shape of Thomas's wounds.
Whenever I preach on Thomas, I also bring up, I tell him he's not doubting Thomas, he's angry Thomas. He's saying, my Savior was not supposed to die on a cross. He did die on a cross. Therefore, I'm not going to believe until this happens. So I always bring that up because he didn't meet his expectations. And at the same time, I think one of the reasons why I draw on that is I've dealt with a lot of people who say, I prayed literally, in one case, I prayed that I was 12 years old. I prayed my grandmother would not die. She died. Therefore, I do not believe in God. And I've dealt with that so many times.
Oh, I hear that. And isn't that the case, like with those two disciples or the two wanderers, as they like to call them, on their way to Emmaus? When they speak of their hope, they speak in the past tense. But we were hoping, we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. In other words, they're saying he wasn't the one to redeem Israel because he hasn't met our expectations of what a redeemer would be. But the Lord, he walks with them, and he listens to them, and then he shuts them up, almost literally. He calls them foolish men. And he reconfigures their imaginations, their biblical imagination, starting with Moses and all the prophets. He schools them in his ways of suffering. Then, in response to their invitation, they give him something. They bring him into their home. He takes their bread, he blesses it, breaks it, gives it to them, and then they know him. Then they're filled with joy. And just like Thomas, like this is in a different gospel. It's not in the same string of the gospel, but in a similar way, the Lord has entered into their sorrow and brought forth joy. He who entered into death and brought forth life has even entered into their sorrow as it was and brought joy from there. And I think, I love the way you're talking about that, the angry Thomas, like that makes a lot of sense to me. And maybe those two wanderers are themselves angry. They're dejected. Their expectations have been broken. And the Lord does not invalidate those. He goes right into the midst of them and creates new life there. That's the principle, well, I don't know if that's the right way to talk about it, but the principle of the resurrection we're dealing with. It's the deed that's done. He has entered into death. He has risen from the dead, but then he communicates that personally to those he loves and brings that resurrection into them to bring them with him.
Wow. And yes, you can see that happening in those scenes. Emmaus is one of my favorite stories. And I took one class, but I'm still able to say I studied biblical archaeology at Harvard University.
Sure.
At the Ridley School.
Sure. Yeah.
But
right.
And so when I've read biblical archaeology and others, and that was one of the things they're looking for. Where is Emmaus? And they know that there's a town as they measure it, in one of about 5 places they figured out. But they said, yes, this is a powerful story, so powerful that we seek to find this place. You talk about a man who lost his son in this. And
Robert Cording.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Robert Cording actually was a longtime professor at College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. I came across him. I actually found an essay he had published, in the Image Journal, a journal of art, poetry, and sort of the Christian culture. And he had written about the death of his adult son, Daniel, who had suffered quite terribly from severe back pain from problems he had with his back, an accidental drug overdose from painkillers. And the first thing that I read from Robert Cording was this essay called In the Unwalled City. And I was so struck by the way in which Robert spoke about his, how do you put this, his confrontation with grief. He would not turn away from grief. Now, I'm not saying this is different from wallowing in your grief.
Right.
But he wasn't looking for consolations, easy or cheap consolations. He was holding on to his love for his son, and he only knows himself. Robert only knows himself in some ways as the father of this man, Daniel. And he still knows Daniel as his son. And yet the way in which he knows Daniel as his son is, this is the son who is not here. This is the one who is absent. So I ended up reaching out to Robert Cording, who said he never does interviews, but he was willing to do an interview with me for our podcast called Church Life Today. And I talked to him about this, and we followed from his essay. And he had a book of poetry that I have actually just read this week under the same title, In the Unwalled City, that's just come out, which is magnificent, just an unbelievable book of poetry about his mourning and his longing for his son. But there's something in Robert's very real sort of flesh and bone witness about what it means for each of us to be whole. To be whole is not to be comfortable. To be whole, especially when we are separated from those we love, to be whole means longing for them. And it means sacrificing for them. It means allowing ourselves to be in some ways incomplete without them. But it also, I think, means, and this is where I took part of his witness and I started to move with it a little bit and respond to it. I talked to him about this afterwards, but it also may mean that our faithful departed, say his son Daniel or those we have loved who have gone before us, if we're hoping and praying for their completion, for their wholeness, for their rest in the Lord, we also ought to be open to the fact that they will not be themselves whole and complete in that rest without us. Mm-hmm. And that's a profoundly Christian anthropological statement, that we are not ourselves by ourselves, that we are created in relationship, for relationship, with others and for others, and we are never ourselves by ourselves. So there's quite a lot. It's an incredible witness from Robert, who's just writing very directly and in some ways very rawly about his mourning and his longing. But at each of the chapters of my book, Our Faithful Departed, I take one of these stories from people who are mourning, and I sort of let those stories speak. Like, I think the stories are so instructive for us. And then I do some of my work as a theologian in responding to those stories and leading us along different paths.
It was a powerful book, and I highly recommend it. It's Our Faithful Departed, Where They Are and Why It Matters by Leonard J. DeLorenzo from the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. I greatly enjoyed this conversation with you. It'll be airing on WROL and also on our podcast at CatholicAudiomedia.com. And I can't thank you enough for taking this time to discuss your book with us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Great to talk with you.
You too. Have a blessed day. We'll be right back right after this. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. I want to call your attention to Catholic TV, which offers great faith-filled, family-friendly programming 24 hours a day. You can find your cable channel at www.getcatholictv.com, and you can watch online on the free apps or check out the YouTube channel. Daily Mass, Rosaries, the Divine Mercy Chaplet, and the Our Lady of Perpetual Help Novena are all available online and on demand. Check out CatholicTV.com. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon here on WROL, 950 AM, 100.3 FM. You can also hear this and other programs at CatholicAudiomedia.com. Have a blessed day. In Cristo vivimos.